Hello, I'm Joanna Franco,
I'm Juan Flores.
and welcome to the Nightly News. Tonight we are going to talk about the 1940s as we go into the 1950s.
Pearl Harbor, conducted by Japanese aircrafts, was the bloody beginning of an awful war between Japan and the United States. It was an unannounced brutal attack upon the United States naval base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The unexpected attack on December 7, 1941, was originally just a preventative effort for keeping the U.S. Pacific Fleet from preventing the war Japan was planning to start in Southeast Asia. The aerial attack bombs resulted in the United States' entry into World War II, which had previously been going on for more than 2 years in Europe. 6 Japanese aircrafts launched 2 aerial attack waves, sinking 4 United States Navy battleships and damaging 2 others. Many U.S. personnel deaths were counted, as well as many wounded. December 7, 1941 was a normal day for the United States battleship crew. In fact, the U.S. Arizona sailors were enjoying their day until the arrival of Japanese aircraft to surprise the soldiers. The sailors thought the arriving aircraft overhead was just another demonstration by the Navy flyers. However, when explosions started rocking the harbor, the American crews concluded this is not a drill. The unannounced Japanese raid took about 2,400 lives, many of which were aboard the USS Arizona. In total, 19 ships were burned or exploded, and more than 120 aircrafts were destroyed. This extreme act of violence spurred American determination, and on December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The whole point of the bombing was a warning for the United States to stay out of the war with Southeast Asia. The United States took that as a calling and entered World War II with determination. To punish Japan after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. cut back on its trade with them, stopping the flow of oil and rubber. The U.S. did its best they could to stop Japan in its war efforts. The Japanese knew that after Pearl Harbor, Americans had the determination for revenge and would be at its peak to stop the Japanese from overcoming Southeast Asia. World War II was the bloodiest and deadliest war the world has ever seen. There were more than 38 million deaths, and many of them were innocent civilians. For the many, the world had provided a sense of hope mixed with fear, but for the minorities, the world was full of death and struggles. The Nazi Party waged a common campaign of terror, but most people thought it was just against the Jews. There are many different minorities that were persecuted throughout the war. The main minority in the war fighting for the United States were the blacks. Racism was still a huge problem during World War II, and it was clearly evident. In World War II, African Americans were the largest racial minority fighting for the United States. They were not allowed to participate in war efforts and were included for many corps that included the Army Air Corps and the Marines. There were some exceptions, though. At the end of the war, they were allowed to fly planes, and blacks were starting to become an important part of the war. The reason why African Americans decided to get in the war is because it provided an end for their struggle, and because many of them lived in rural poverty. Many minorities had absolutely little to no money, and benefits of being in the war provided things such as benefits, like food, water, and a place to live. After returning home, minorities found that they were still not granted full rights. And this became a huge problem for them because they struggled and fought for the war to end discrimination. In 1941, Roosevelt issued the Executive Order 8802, which imprisoned many Japanese Americans because of fear of spies. The Army didn't accept them, and they were basically segregated to separate units.
At the beginning of this tragic event in the 1940s, known as the Holocaust, where Hitler was extending his empire, he decided to move all the Jewish and Egypts to the Poland ghettos, where he would then build concentration camps and move them in there. He would first move the old people, the children and women to the concentration camps, telling them that they will have a great education. It was a place where they could be free, and it was all a huge lie. Which then, by the 1940s, he built the first concentration camp with gas chambers, making many people, exactly more than 5 million Jewish, be killed, and he brutally mistreated them. By the 1942, many of the Jewish were marked by a yellow star, which then that would mean that they couldn't go out of the country or go any other place or even if they had like passport or papers. Um, but in 1943, all the Jewish that were marked with that yellow star, they were moved to the concentration camps, which at the end was a huge massacre of humankind, exterminating more than 3 million people. And it was a horrific significant to history and of humankind. Now, as we speak about of the 1945s, in February of 1945, the Jalta Conference meeting with the leaders, the three leaders, President Franklin, Soviet leader Stanley, and the British minister Winston, met in the Jalta Conference to see what if they could do any dealing on the post-war. Um, this argument was also part of what would happen to Germany, which was divided then in 4 zones controlled by 4 different countries, and also to prevent Germany from gaining their military power back up again. Then, in the same month of April, they decided to schedule another meeting where they would discuss about what would they contribute to each other. In this meeting, Stanley agreed to have a free election in Eastern Europe, which also he said that he would also cooperate in the Japan War. The Jalta Conference became controversial after the Soviet Americans wartime broke. Then, in the same month of April, they decided to schedule another meeting where they would discuss about what would they contribute to each other. In this meeting, Stanley agreed to have a free election in Eastern Europe, which also he said that he would also cooperate in the Japan War. The Jalta Conference became controversial after the Soviet Americans wartime broke. Also, Stanley broke his promise about having the free election in Eastern Europe, which created a huge shock to the U.S., which they also got angry. This also escalated very dramatically, which led to the Cold War.
On August 6, 1945, during World War II, an American B-29 bomber dropped the world's first deployed atomic bomb over Hiroshima, Japan. The explosion wiped out 90% of the city and immediately killed 80,000 people. 3 days later, a second B-29 dropped another bomb on Nagasaki, killing about 40,000 people. Japan's Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender of World War II on August 15th. This all started with the Manhattan Project. Before the outbreak of war, American scientists became concerned with nuclear weapons research being conducted in Nazi Germany. In 1940, the U.S. government began funding its own atomic weapons deployment program. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was tasked with spearheading the construction for facilities for the top secret program, codenamed the Manhattan Project. Over the next several years, the scientists worked on producing the nuclear fission. On July 16, 1945, was the first successful test of an atomic device in New Mexico. By the time of the test in New Mexico, the Allies had defeated Germany. Japan, however, vowed to fight until the end. In late July, Japan rejected the Allied demand for surrender and put forward a post-Dom declaration, which threatened the Japanese with prompt and utter destruction if they rejected the Allied demand for surrender and put forward a post-Dom declaration, which threatened the Japanese with prompt and utter destruction if they refused. After the use of atomic bombs, Japan surrendered. This still impacts us today because Japan is still trying to recover from these bombs that were dropped. During World War II, around 350,000 women served in the U.S. Armed Forces, both at home and abroad. Also, widespread male enlistment left gaping holes in the industrial labor force. Between 1940 and 1945, the female percentage of the U.S. workforce increased from 27% to nearly 37%. And by 1945, nearly 1 out of every 4 women worked outside the home, in addition to factory work and other home front jobs. General George Marshall supported the idea of introducing a women's branch in the Army. In May 1942, Congress instituted the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, which had full military status. By 1945, there were more than 100,000 women in the Auxiliary Corps and 6,000 female officers. One of the lesser-known roles women played in the war effort was provided by the Women's Air Force, service pilots. These women became the first women to fly American military aircraft. While women worked in a variety of positions, the aviation industry saw the greatest increase in female workers. The munitions industry also heavily recruited women workers, as represented by the U.S. government's Rosie the Riveter propaganda campaign. Rosie became one of the most successful recruitment tools in U.S. history, and the most iconic image of working women during World War II. Now over to Nayla.
World War II was arguably the most significant event of the 20th century. The primary combatants were the Allied powers, which included the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain. On the other side were the Axis powers, which included Italy, Germany, and Japan. The war started because of the instability created in Germany after World War I, because the Treaty of Versailles set harsh punishments for Germany. The war lasted for 6 years, and it ended when the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs in Japan, one in Nagasaki and one in Hiroshima. After the war, the Soviet Union and the United States both emerged as 2 world powers to start the Cold War. Roosevelt was the president who led us through World War II. Under Roosevelt's leadership, our nation rebounded after the Pearl Harbor attack in December 1941, which was the reason that our nation got involved in World War II. He built a powerful wartime coalition with the Soviet Union and Great Britain. Unfortunately, Roosevelt died in poor health in April 12, 1945. His vice president, Harry Truman, assumed the presidency and made the controversial decision to drop 2 atomic bombs in Japan, which ended the war. Today, Truman led us through the Cold War.
Women's clothes of the 1940s were typically modeled after the utility clothes produced during war rationing. Also, due to war rationing, skirts and dresses were made shorter. Square shoulders, narrow hips, and skirts that ended just below the knee were also popular. Women's fashion was all about creating a certain silhouette, like an hourglass figure. Men typically wore suits, ties, and hats. For entertainment in the 1940s, people typically went to go watch movies, went to sporting events, watched TV, listened to the radio, or went to parties. 80% of households in the United States owned a radio, and 90 million Americans went to the movies every week. For music, jazz, big bands, and swing music became very popular. Many popular shows and movies like Doolittle Raid and 30 Seconds of Summer came out, and popular songs like I'll Be Home by Christmas and If Only in My Dreams also came out.